What's up, everybody? My name is Jacob Hardison, and today I'm going to give you 5 tips so that way you can go faster at the track. All right, so welcome back, everybody, to another video on the lovely Adrenaline RC YouTube channel. And today we, of course, are going to give you 5 tips to be able to go faster at the track. Now, one thing that you will notice as we go through these today is that they are going to pertain more to the newer driver end of things, the more kind of like getting into the track driving. So for those of you that are on the more advanced end of things, this might not be as helpful, but maybe I'll go over something that you just don't happen to think about while you're at the track. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get into our first of 5 tips. So tip number 1 is going to be something that maybe seems a little bit more on the obvious side, but it's one of those things that can almost be so obvious that it's overlooked. So the very, very first part of this first tip is going to be more pertaining to the electric end of things, which is making sure that your ESC is calibrated to your radio properly. You don't want to be driving around the track and have some weird throttle or brake input that isn't what you are trying to do exactly. You want it to be very direct as to whatever input you give it, that the car matches it when you are on the track. The second thing, or the part 2 of this first one, is going to be, of course, making sure that your steering is set up properly. You definitely don't want to have the car veering off one way or the other. You want to make sure you have even steering on both sides, because again, when you give those inputs into the car, you want to know exactly what it's going to do. You want to be able to expect that it is going to do what you are telling it to do. And then to go along again with that servo thing is going to be, if you have a nitro car specifically, definitely making sure that you have your throttle servo set properly at a neutral point, that your opening on the carb is only opening to the size of the venturi, and that, of course, you're not overextending the brake on the servo to where you are actually pushing it against the engine itself. So a bit of a compound for our very first tip, but as a quick recap, make sure your ESC is calibrated. Make sure if you're running a nitro car that your throttle servo is set properly for your carburetor, and then make sure that you have your steering set on the front of your vehicle to make sure it goes straight, and then of course that you have full even throw to the left and to the right. Tip number 2 is going to be something that is going to be super duper important, especially, well, not even especially on the off-road end of things. It's going to be especially important on the on-road and off-road end of things. So I don't know where I was going with that. But tip number 2 is going to be to have the right tires and compound. The vehicle itself, you could have the greatest setup on the planet on your car, something that is absolutely perfect, can not get any better. But if you don't have the right tire on the car, then it's not going to matter. And then vice versa, you could have a really poor setup on the car, but by having the right set of tires, that can help to kind of make up for that a little bit. So definitely make sure that when you get to the track, you keep an eye on the temperature outside, the style of surface, dust level, maybe even go check to see just what other drivers are using at the time. Even if you're not using the same tread company, like, whether you're using a J Concepts or a Proline or AKA, maybe it's something that, you're using a similar tread pattern to that. So even if you're not running the exact same tire, you'll get an idea of what tread pattern to run, whether it be a larger lug, small pin, bar tire. And then past that, once you have the actual tread pattern itself selected, then of course you're going to want to make sure that you have the right compound selected. So, generally on a hotter, more abrasive track, you're going to use a stiffer compound. On a cooler track or a more loamy track, not as aggressive, you use a softer tire. And then, of course, generally on an indoor clay track, you'll use a clay compound tire. So tip number 2, make sure you have the right tires and make sure you have the right compounded tires. It can definitely be something that will make or break the run. It is very, very important. A lot of people say anywhere 75%, 90% of the setup. So make sure you have the right tires. Tip number 3 is going to be turn your power down. Now you may be thinking that seems a little backwards, because if you want to go faster, wouldn't you want more power? And the simple, non-insightful answer is technically yes. But in the grand scheme of things, the majority of tracks anywhere in the world, you probably aren't going to need to use full power. And I'm going to cite our indoor track like I always do. To run the quickest lap on the indoor track, I think I'm running, or at least, well, I don't have the quickest lap on the track, but I know that between myself and the person who has the quickest lap on the track, Mr. Lee, Neither of us are actually running full power on our cars because the track simply doesn't need it. A lot of tracks, especially these tighter indoor ones, having extra power is just going to make the car feel very finicky. It's going to feel unpredictable because you're going to be carrying way too much speed into different places, and it just, at that lower power gives you a more consistent feel. Now, the other thing to look into, especially because these 5 tips are more pertaining to that beginner level end of things, there's an okay chance that as you're getting into it, you probably just don't have the skill built up just yet to be able to handle the full power. So even though having the extra power might allow you to make the biggest jump on the track, if it's really hard to drive the rest of the track, especially again, while you're learning, you're getting into it, it can make the car, again, unpredictable and be very discouraging because it's going to be very difficult to drive. So the 2 things to look out for there, of course, are going to be what size of track you're looking for, and then whether you as a driver can handle that power. Something that I do usually tell people is start out, with a lower power setting to where you can handle it around the track fairly well. And once you get to a very consistent lap time point with that, then go ahead and bump it up another 5%. So let's say you start at 60%, you get really consistent there, bump up to 65. Once you get really consistent at 65, bump up to 70, and then you can kind of work from there, and it gives you continual goals to be able to hit, and it also will give you an idea of, all right, I know that, maybe once you get to the top end, maybe you hit 85%, get consistent there, go to 90. Maybe 90 isn't going to be the power level you need. Maybe that's going to be too much. So you'll get a lot more in-depth, close look as to what the power level you need even might be. Now, if you're curious as to where to start there, like I said, if you're super duper, like brand new, fresh into it, don't be afraid. Start somewhere in the 50-60% area. But if you are, not brand new, but you want to get a general idea of where to start, go again to somebody at your local track and just ask, hey, what power level are you running, or what do you think is a good power level to start out for this track? And then you can just kind of work from there. So again, tip number 3 is going to be turn your power down to something that can be very consistent for you and your skill level as a driver. So tip number 4 is going to be just making sure that you have the appropriate oils in your vehicle for the track and the day. The day meaning, whether it's a really hot day or a really cool day. Generally on hotter days, you'll run thicker oils. Generally on cooler days, you'll run thinner oils. A place that I usually like to start at, and there are going to be, of course, different variables here depending on what you have in your shocks or what style diff you have. But generally speaking, for the majority of A-scale vehicles, I feel like diff-wise, starting in the front with a 7,000 in the center, and either a 4,000 or a 5,000 in the rear, that's usually a good baseline. If you are using something like the associated Buggy, where you have the option of LTC versus HTC, you can still follow that 774, 775 area, but for the LTC, then of course you would have to bump up a little bit to, maybe like a 10-10-7, 15-15-7. It will vary a little bit again from car to car and diff to diff, but generally that 774, 775 area is a good place to start. Shock oil wise, I like to start somewhere at 35 to 40 unless I just know that it's really, really hot or really, really cold on a day. And again, this is going to be something that you can ask local guys at your track to get just a general idea. And the reason it's important to, of course, make sure that your oils are correct is that if you're way too stiff on your shocks or way too thin on your shocks, the car can feel really bouncy, really unpredictable, just feel really finicky going around the track, not really feel like it's in the track giving you a consistent drive. Even if it's not the fastest setup, you want something that's going to be consistent. Same thing for the diffs. If you go too thick or too thin, then of course you can run into an inconsistent car. So I like to start again with those baselines and then, adjust. I believe it is for every like 2.5 to 5 weight. It's like a 10-degree change outside. So every 10-degree change, you'll usually go 2.5 to 5 weight or 50 to 100 CST difference. If I remember correctly, I think that's what it is. So, as it gets warmer or colder, you'll adjust appropriately. That way, of course, you get a good, consistent feeling car on the track. So tip number 4 is just making sure that you have the appropriate oils in your car for the surface and temperature that you are driving on. So tip number 5 is going to be to get track time. Track time is going to be very important to help continue to build and maintain your reflexes and reaction time, and it's going to help you continue to get better and better. The more and more laps you have on the track, the more you're going to be able to pick up on the nuances of the track and the more consistent that you are going to get. And in the grand scheme of things, consistency wins races. So that's a very, very important thing to do. The other thing to take into account with track time is, let's say you mostly race a skill electric buggy, but you have the opportunity to go out and race mini Zs, for example. Even though it's not the exact same medium, it is still going to continue to build up those reflexes and reaction times. And in theory, it gives you a little bit more wide range of skill because now you're experiencing different things while you're driving around the track, if that makes sense. So track time, regardless of what it is, what you're driving, is going to be very, very important. And it's going to be important to go out and practice. I like to recommend at least once a week, but if you can, maybe not once a week, but maybe you have a race you're going to on a Saturday or a Sunday. It's good to get in a couple days before and at least get a little bit of time, even if it's not on a super weekly basis. So tip number 5 is going to be just to get track time in. So my honorable mention for today of our tips video, so I guess it's really a 6-tip video, is going to be to not change your setup every single time you go out and run. And again, this is going to be more on that beginner end of things. And the reason why I say this is because as a beginner, as you're looking to get faster and faster, you probably aren't going to be able to feel the changes a whole lot. You're just going to notice that the car is going to be different, but you won't necessarily be able to explain or handle why at this point. And that's just because, again, you're very fresh into it. You're just jumping in. As you get further and further and you build up more and more skill, then, I will say, don't be afraid to change that up a little bit. But the most important thing, well, not the most important thing, all of these are important, but one of the most important things is just having consistency in the vehicle itself. That way, when you go out, you already kind of have an idea of how it's going to drive, and you're not trying to learn how to drive and learn what the setup is doing at the exact same time. So get a good baseline setup. That way you can just get packs and packs and packs in, build up the repetition, build up the skill, the reflexes, the reaction time, and then that will help you, again, to continue building up that skill. So tip number 6, don't change your setup every single time you hit the track. So now we've gone over our honorable mention. That will, of course, bring us to the end of today's video. I hope, of course, just like all my other videos, that this has been helpful for you. And I do plan on in the near-ish future, sometime in the future, to do another video kind of in this style, but do a little bit more of an advanced tips for those of you that just already have a little bit more time out on the track, a little bit more experience, and then we can kind of get the full encompassment of skill level. So keep an eye out for that. But I hope that this has been helpful for you guys today. Maybe I hit something that you didn't think of before you hit the track. If you have any questions, definitely leave them down below, and we look forward to seeing you in the next one.